Okay, so this is Chapter 1, Introduction to the Human Body. We are going to start out by defining anatomy and physiology. Then we're going to discuss the levels of structural organization, followed by the characteristics of life, homeostasis. We're going to introduce some basic anatomical terminology and medical imaging. So anatomy is the study of structures, and physiology is the study of function, so how the body works. However, structure and function you're going to find always go hand in hand. Structure relies on function, function relies on structure. So it's very difficult to separate out the study of structure and function since they coexist and kind of rely on each other and are interdependent. If you change the structure, you change the function. There's a list of subspecialties on table 1.1 in your book you might want to glance at in case you're considering careers. You have things like embryology, which is the first 8 weeks of development, neurophysiology, focusing on the nerve cells, endocrinology, focusing on the hormones and how they control our bodily functions, just to name a few. So, organizationally speaking, our bodies start out at the chemical level with atoms. So, SNOPs, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Then you have molecules, for example, DNA. Molecules will combine to form muscle cells or cells in general. So smooth muscle cells are an example. Cells then combine to form tissues, like a smooth muscle cell would form smooth muscle tissue. Tissues combine to form organs, like the stomach, for example. Some muscular layers there. Organs develop into organ systems. They all combine. So you have multiple organs in an organ system. And then, of course, the organism. So we have 6 relevant levels. The chemical level, which we'll talk about in Chapter 2. Atoms combine to form molecules. So you have nucleic acids, carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins being the 4 main molecules in our bodies that we care about. Nucleic acids like DNA, of course. Carbohydrates like glucose. Lipids, your triglycerides, and then so many proteins. Cellular, we're going to talk about in Chapter 3. So the cell again, the basic structural and functional unit of life. There are a lot of specialized cells in our body. Blood cells, nerve cells, epithelial cells, muscle cells, for example. Chapter 4, we're going to talk about tissues, which remember cells combine to form tissues, and then those cells perform specific functions. We have 4 main types of tissues: epithelial, muscle, nerve, and connective. Epithelial tissue's main function is to cover the inner and outer surfaces, and they also form glands. Muscle tissue provides movements by contraction. Nervous tissue, of course, coordinating our bodily functions using electrical impulses. And then connective tissue has quite a variety of functions: binding, supporting, protecting, transporting, etc. It's a lot of filler and cushion in certain areas. Then you have organs. Remember, different tissues combine to form organs. Those organs then work together and perform a specific, or those tissues work together and perform a specific function. Organ systems, there's 11 body systems in our bodies. You guys are going to need to know the functions along with the components associated with each. So the organ system is when a bunch of organs form that particular system, like the digestive system, for example. Anatomy 1 and Anatomy 2 combined cover all 11 body systems. And then the organism. All of the body systems work together to maintain homeostasis, which, remember from biology, homeostasis is a happy, steady state in our body, that internal balance that our body achieves. Remember that homeostasis, the range that is maintained in our body, is a very narrow range. Like, for example, our blood pH is 7.35 to 7.45. So it's a pretty limited range there. So our body has a narrow range that it likes to stay happy within. Life characteristics, so separating non-living from living. Metabolism, living things metabolize. So metabolism is the sum of all the chemical reactions in your body. Anabolism is when things are built, so you build up substances through chemical reactions. Catabolism is breaking things down. So if you have an amino acid plus an amino acid plus an amino acid, etc., yielding a protein, that's an example of an anabolism. If you have a protein being broken down into an amino acid and all of its amino acid components, that would be catabolism. So digestion is a certain type of catabolism. When you eat food, you take in food and you break it down into its components. We cannot eat food as we utilize food as we eat it. So if we eat a hamburger, for example, we cannot use that hamburger meat in its current state. We have to break it down into its amino acid and protein components. Responsiveness is the second characteristic of life. It's your ability to interact with the environment, basically. You can respond to environmental changes. So if you go outside and all of a sudden it's really cold, your body's going to shiver in order to generate heat. Or on the other hand, if you go outside and it's really hot, your body's going to sweat to try to cool off your body. So you can react to those changes in the environment, whether it's internal or external. You can react to them. Movement, moving your body either as a whole, like when you walk, or internally, internal movement. Peristalsis is how our digestive system digests food. It uses peristalsis to move the food along the digestive tract. Growth, increasing the size or cell number. So you can divide, your cells can divide, for example, and one will turn into two, or to increase in size. Differentiation is the process which unspecialized cells become specialized. So we have non-committed stem cells divide and become functionally committed cells. So non-committed stem cells will turn into adult stem cells for the skin, for example. Reproduction, making new cells, of course. Mitosis is asexual reproduction, but its purpose is growth and repair, which is very important. Meiosis is sexual reproduction, and that's the formation of the egg and sperm, which of course will come together through fertilization to form the zygote. Homeostasis is that process that we maintain our internal balance, so we stabilize our bodies and help maintain that happy, steady state. Some factors that have to be maintained: glucose, pH, our water balance, temperature, blood pressure, electrolytes. All of those have to be maintained within the range that our body is happy. Internally speaking, we have intracellular and extracellular fluid. Intracellular is the fluid inside the cells. Inside. Extracellular fluid is the fluid outside the cells. So extra would be outside, surrounding the cells. So there, intracellular fluid inside the cell, extracellular fluid outside. Examples of extracellular fluid: we have interstitial fluid, which is tissue fluid; plasma, which is the blood fluid; synovial fluid, which is joint fluid; and cerebrospinal fluid, which is the spinal cord and brain. Most of those fluids are mainly composed of water, which have some dissolved solutes inside of them, and the concentrations will be different depending on which fluid you're talking about. Glucose is a big one. Proteins, ions, oxygen, carbon dioxide, waste products, and as I said, the concentrations are going to vary depending on which particular fluid you're talking about. So a big concept here is, in order to maintain that happy internal environment, substances are constantly moving back and forth between the intracellular fluid and the extracellular fluid. and the interstitial fluid in the blood plasma by the capillaries. So maintaining this happy, steady state is not an easy job, and a lot of substances have to move back and forth and be transported in order to successfully do this. So, what happens if dynamic internal balance is disrupted? Your health is compromised. It can be anywhere from mild to severe. So you could be talking about you have a cold, or you could talk about kidney failure. So there are many things in between. So how do we maintain homeostasis? Well, we have feedback mechanisms. We have negative feedback mechanisms and positive feedback mechanisms. Negative feedback mechanisms reverse the stimulus, reverse the condition. So if your blood pressure goes up, our body tries to get it back down. If your temperature goes up, our body tries to get it back down. If your blood glucose goes down, we try to get it back up. So it's the opposite. Positive feedback intensifies that and amplifies that initial stimulus. So labor and blood clotting are really the two examples of positive feedback in our body. Most everything else is negative feedback. But with labor, for example, the baby's head presses against the cervix, and that pressure causes the hormone oxytocin to be released. Oxytocin is responsible for uterine contractions. The more pressure that the baby's head pushes against the cervix, the more oxytocin is released, the stronger the uterine contractions. All the way until the baby is born, stimulus is gone, body returns to normal. Same kind of idea with blood clotting. You cut yourself and platelets come to the scene. Platelets release chemicals that attract more platelets, and more platelets keep coming until the tear is sealed. So again, the majority of feedback loops in our body are negative, but labor and blood clotting are positive. So two body systems play a major role in feedback and maintaining homeostasis: the endocrine and the nervous system. The endocrine system produces chemical messages called hormones, and these hormones then travel to wherever their destination is to bring about the desired response. Endocrine system is slower than the nervous system, but the effects can last longer. The nervous system, the messages are nerve impulses, so action potentials. It's a more rapid response, but it lasts for a shorter period of time. So the nervous system, nervous impulses, action potentials, rapid response, but short-lived. The endocrine system, hormones, which are the chemical messengers, slower response, but can be longer lasting. So the feedback loop, the receptors are what monitor the changes. Once it picks up a change, it sends the information to the control center through an afferent pathway, so incoming pathway. The control center sets the standard for the controlled condition, so whatever it's supposed to be set at, it's going to evaluate that input, which is usually the brain or central nervous system, and then it's going to generate an output to the effector using an efferent pathway. And again, the output can be a chemical or a nerve impulse. So you have the input coming in through an afferent pathway from a receptor, sends it to the control center, and then an output or a response through an efferent pathway to an effector. There you go. So this is just a chart showing you the stimulus, the controlled condition, receptors pick up, something's changed, send it to the control center sends a response through the effectors, and we return to homeostasis. Here's a specific example of negative feedback loop. So baroreceptors, which are pressure sensors in the blood vessels, detect something's wrong with your blood pressure, send that to the brain. The brain will then send a message to the heart and blood vessels to fix the blood pressure, so decrease the heart rate, dilate the blood vessels, bringing the blood pressure back up. Other positive feedback here. We have childbirth. So stretch receptors in the cervix realize the baby's ready to be born, start stretching out. Send it to the control centers in the brain. Brain then sends messages to the walls of the uterus saying that the stretch, requires more stretch and more stretch and more stretch until the baby is born, decreases the stretching, and cuts the feedback loop. Couple of definitions here. Disorder is any abnormality of structure or function. It's kind of a more generic term. A disease is a recognizable set of signs and symptoms, so this is more specific. So if you say someone has a disorder, it's kind of just saying you're not really sure what exactly it is wrong. It's just a generic, there's something wrong. A disease is a specific diagnosis that they've been given. This is what they have specifically. Symptoms are subjective changes from what is normal. So if you feel nauseous, if you feel lightheaded, you can't really measure nausea. You can't really measure lightheadedness. So those would be symptoms. Signs are things that you can measure. So these are objective changes. So you can measure your heart rate. You can measure your blood pressure. Here are the pictures from your book, the anatomical position. Palms facing forward, feet apart. These are different areas of the body that you guys need to be familiar with. So the regional names, so make sure you look over these. Directional terminology, this is one body part relative to another. So you have lateral is towards the outside, away from the midline. Medial is towards the midline. Superior is towards the head. Inferior is away from the head or above. Superior is towards the head, or you could say something is superior to another, meaning it's above it. And then inferior is below. Proximal and distal, you're referring to your limbs. So proximal is closer to the point of origin. Distal is further away from the point of origin. So again, you would say things like the sternum is medial to the humerus, kind of thing. You could say the lungs are superior to the intestine. You could say the humerus is proximal to the phalanges. That kind of thing. Planes are cuts that are made. The sagittal divides the body into right and left sides. Mid-sagittal is equal portion right down the middle through the midline. Parasagittal is anything off of the midline. The frontal or coronal divides the body into anterior and posterior portions. And the transverse divides the body into superior and inferior halves. Oblique passes through at an angle. So here are some different cuts of the brain. You have the mid-sagittal section, the frontal section, and the transverse section. Body cavities, that should say dorsal. I apologize. The back, the ventral is the front. The dorsal is further subdivided into the cranial and the vertebral. The cranial holds the brain. The vertebral holds the spinal cord. The ventral is further subdivided into the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic. The thoracic has the pleural cavities, which are the lungs, the pericardial cavity, which holds the heart, and then the mediastinum, which is in between. The abdominal cavity has the stomach, the spleen, the liver, gallbladder, your intestines. And the pelvic cavity has the bladder, uterus, and reproductive organs, except for the testes, of course. So the abdominal usually deals with digestion, pelvic, reproduction, and urinary. I apologize. Often it's termed the abdominal pelvic. The diaphragm is what divides the thoracic and the abdominal pelvic cavities. So here's a picture giving you the cavities, where they're at, color-coded for your convenience, and what is within each cavity. This is showing you the pleural and the pericardial cavities. So in blue, you have the thoracic cavity. Diaphragm is the bottom. In greenish, whatever color that is, you have the abdominal cavity. So each lung is surrounded by a pleural membrane, which is in the pleural cavity. So you have the right and left pleural cavities. The parietal pleura is the outside that lines the cavity. The visceral pleura is the inside that's on top of the organ. So the serous membrane has two layers with serous fluid in between. The parietal layer is the outside. The visceral layer is the inside. Then you have the pericardial cavity, which has the heart, and again, the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. Parietal pericardium lines the cavity. Visceral pericardium is on top of the heart. The 9 regions that our body is divided into, the right and left hypochondriac, right and left lumbar, right and left inguinal, and then down the middle you have the epigastric, umbilical, and hypogastric. Umbilical, of course, is around your belly button. So here's a picture with the person behind it for reference. Here's a picture with the organs in place for reference, so you can see which organs are where. These regions are very important if you go to a hospital and a doctor or a nurse is trying to tell the other where pain is located. And then you have the 4 quadrants, right and left upper, right and left lower. And here's the organs within each one to show you. So a membrane is a thin, pliable tissue that covers and lines structures. We have serous membranes, which are internal coverings, cutaneous membranes, which are actually dry membranes, so the skin, mucous membranes, which cover areas that open to the outside world, and then synovial membranes, which are your joints. Serous membranes, as I said, are 2-layer membranes that have serous fluid between them. The parietal lines the body organ, the visceral covers the organ, and then that serous fluid is very important because it reduces friction. And if you think about it, your heart is continuously beating, your lungs are continuously breathing. You do not want them rubbing up against anything, so that serous fluid is very important. This is just showing you a cross section so you can see. So that is it. If you have any questions, send me a message.